So it's a real privilege to be here. What I thought I'd try to do tonight is to flesh out some thoughts about how we can think about that truce flag as well as flags in the Civil War in general, because flags of the Civil War were, of course, freighted with as much meaning as any flags have ever been freighted with. And so I want to start with a quote this evening from an Afro-Guyanese playwright and poet named John Agar, which you can see quoted there, which is that a flag's a piece of cloth that makes the guts of men grow bold. And that quote seems to me very provocative and rich because it draws our attention to the fact that a flag is this piece of cloth at one level. Its limb hangs there, the wind isn't blowing, and it seems to be to bear little symbolic weight in some ways, and yet on the other hand, a flag is a means of conveying a society's loftiest ambitions, aspirations, as well as it can be a symbol of its bitterest grievances. And that was certainly true of the flags that were displayed during the American Civil War. And one point I would draw your attention to is if you look at the visual art produced during the Civil War and after the Civil War to make sense of the war, you may be struck by how often you'll see a flag in the art, whether it's a Confederate flag if it's associated with Confederacy, or of course the American flag here. And this was in Harper's Weekly and in 1864, and you can see it's obviously imagined. That's certainly the youngest looking, it looks like a sort of Botoxed Abraham Lincoln. But that was a re-election image, in other words, in 1864, clearly associating Lincoln directly with the American flag, understandably so. Well, it's inconceivable that Americans could have waged the Civil War without flags because they were I'm sorry, there's a drawer I was trying to get set here. It's inconceivable they could have waged the war without flags because they were essential to invoking military fervor. And no military muster was complete without a flag. And that was true even millennia before Fort Sumter was fired on. So we can find carvings like this ancient Roman carving from near Naples, which depicts an ancient Roman military banner. In the Middle Ages, there were, of course, wonderfully colorful banners. This is from a French image depicting the French Agincourt. In the early modern times, flags became even more important because as weaponry became more lethal, especially at greater distances, flags were essential to distinguish friend from foe. So the loss of the flag to the enemy was especially ignominious. It's one thing to surrender as an individual, but to surrender the flag, that's a whole different level of ignominy. So indeed, after the Civil War, the fate of Confederate flags that the Union Army captured became highly political and sparked bitter quarrels between those Union veterans who wanted to return the flags to the South as a gesture of reconciliation, and other Union soldiers who refused, who recoiled at the idea of offering any symbolic gesture of honor to would-be destroyers of the Republic. And to give you some idea of how significant the return of flags were, this is, as you can see, oh, I didn't put the date up there, I'm sorry. This is 1905, when captured flags, that is Confederate battle flags captured during the Civil War, were returned to Florida. And so the former governor and the current governor and assorted other eminent figures are gathered there for this public celebration in the state capitol in Tallahassee for the return of those flags. So as flags should, the standards of the Union and Confederate armies, or nations, expressed how each side saw themselves. And I'll start with the Union flag, or the familiar American flag. Of course, at the start of the Civil War, there were, well, before the secession of the Confederacy, there were 34 states. So there were 34 stars in the American flag in 1861. But the interesting thing is, throughout the duration of the Civil War, the United States maintained the same flag with those 34 stars. There was never any acknowledgement in the flag that the states of the Confederacy had withdrawn. This is the flag, as you can see, that Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. carried with him. Here's the flag as it looked in some designs after the addition of West Virginia, which seceded from Virginia in 1863 and joined the Union, and so there were 35 states, or 35 stars. So this virtually unchanged flag was consonant with Abraham Lincoln's idea of the Republic and his belief that the secession of the southern states was an ephemeral gesture, and that you couldn't break the bonds of what he called the mystic cords of memory that bound American people to the nation. So the flag that the Union troops marched beneath was consistent with the national flag before the Civil War and after the Civil War. So this flag is not one that we associate exclusively with the Civil War. It is, if you will, the permanent American flag. The only thing that changes are how many stars we have. So after the Civil War, some embittered white Southerners did regard this flag as a symbol of Yankee tyranny. And it was displayed, shall we say, it was not displayed, is probably a better way to put it, as widely as it might have been until the resentment mellowed at the end of the 19th century. And by then, the American flag was universally embraced as a symbol of American pride. The Confederacy, by way of contrast, was literally a state at war through virtually all of its existence. So the flags of the Confederacy were, almost by definition, flags of war. And because it was a newly birthed nation, and it was a nation constantly evolving during its brief existence, the Confederacy had multiple flags, as this slide. How interesting. Some of them are not showing up on this slide, but they did on my slide. That's very interesting. Well, I will describe some that are not present there. The one at the top was the original, because that was the flag for the Confederacy when the original states had seceded and formed the original Confederacy. There was only the Deep South. A few months later, after Lincoln calls up the troops after Fort Sumter, more states seceded, so they had more. Eventually, they even added stars for Kentucky, which never joined the Confederacy, but it should be aspirational, right? So include what you want, even if you don't have it. So they added more stars, so that the one that at the top is called the Stars and Bars. And as you can see, it fairly closely resembles the American flag, which was entirely intentional, because the founders of the Confederate nation wanted to underscore that they thought they were the truest Americans, that they were truest to the original inspiration of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, and that it was Yankees who had actually deviated. So this flag was a testament to their commitment to the founding principles of the nation, as they saw. The problem, as you might imagine, was when you put that flag on a battlefield and the American flag on the battlefield, it's often very hard to tell them apart, unless the wind is blowing them out so that you can see them fully extended. So it was not ideally suited to the battlefield. I should add that there were actually in total 5 versions of that Stars and Bars, so it kept evolving to virtually the end of the war. And one of the last iterations had a big white band on it, which is relevant for our discussion tonight, because it was often called the Stars and Bars Truce flag, because it seemed to imply truce, and then they decided, well, that was a bad idea. So, as I say, this is a continually evolving flag. Well, eventually, or I shouldn't say eventually, during the war itself, because of the limitations of the Stars and Bars, Confederate troops began adopting a different design, which we think of now as the Confederate battle flag, which is the square flag there. That was associated especially with the Army of Northern Virginia, and especially with the Army of Northern Virginia once Robert E. Lee took command in 1862. Eventually, the flag that most of us associate communicate with is, of course, the battle flag at the bottom, which is actually the Navy Jack. It's the Navy flag, not the flag that was actually carried by infantry during the war. In any case, that the battle flag would become the symbol of the Confederate nation was apt, because the survival of the Confederacy was inseparable from the survival of the Confederate Army. The Southern Republic was only 2 months old when the Civil War started, and the Confederacy collapsed, literally, as soon as Robert E. Lee's army surrendered, and then Joseph Johnston's army surrendered just a few weeks later. So, in the absence of an army, there was no Confederacy. So, there's the flag that we are all familiar with. Well, 75 years, roughly, after white Southerners, or I should say 75 years after the Civil War, white Southerners reaffirmed the association of the Confederate battle flag with contemporary, I mean by that contemporary to them, resistance and belligerence, when they unfurled it during a protracted campaign to thwart racial integration and to preserve segregation. In 1948, the States' Rights Democratic Party, also known as the Dixiecrats, adopted the battle flag as a battle emblem when they bucked the regular Democratic Party. And they contested Truman's presidential re-election, or I should say his election campaign in 1948 on a pro-segregation platform. You can obviously see the battle flag in the center there, but over here on the left, I'm sure you've noticed it, but it's worth drawing attention to Robert E. Lee's portrait being held up. So there is a clear, this is an invocation not just of the battle flag, but of the whole Confederate, the mythic Confederate lost cause. Well, the genteel white supremacists in the South, in what was known as the Citizens Council and other regional organizations, also adopted the Confederate battle flag. Oh, I'm sorry, this was, of course, Strom Thurmond, who was the presidential candidate in 1948 with his then, I think was this his first of 4 wives, or was this his second of 4 wives? I'm not sure. But in any case, you can see the battle flag being waved right there. But here's the emblem of the Citizens Council. And you can see how directly they are linking the symbols of the Confederacy with their contemporary battle for racial integrity. And of course, the Confederate battle flag was also adopted by the revived Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist terrorist organizations in St. Augustine, Florida in 1964, when they were protesting Martin Luther King, SCLC's campaign to desegregate St. Augustine. So by the early 1960s, the display of a Confederate battle flag decal on an automobile bumper or in a front yard of a private home was an unambiguous and potent endorsement of white Southern nationalism. And I just recently was watching a wonderful movie, In the Heat of the Night. And if you all have seen In the Heat of the Night, and you remember there's a scene when Virgil Tibbs, who's the African-American policeman from Philadelphia, played by Sidney Poitier, is driving on a road near Sparta, Mississippi, and there's a car of white, belligerent, air quote, rednecks who come up behind him. You don't even have to know anything about them in that movie because they are immediately identified by a Confederate battle flag license plate on the front of the car. And you see that coming up behind him, and you already know Virgil Tibbs is in trouble. So that symbol was so firmly rooted that it could be used in classic film like, a contemporary classic film like In the Heat of the Night to convey a message instantaneously. Well, the defeat of Southern white resistance to desegregation and legal equality for African Americans during the 1960s had contradictory consequences for the proliferating uses of the Confederate flag and for the meanings of the flag. With each passing year, the flags graced more and more consumer items, most of which would have offended the sensibilities and, of course, the taste of the founders of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And these aren't founders, these are just members from 1912. From its founding in 1894 until the mid-20th century, the United Daughters of the Confederacy denounced the commercial exploitation of the Confederate battle flag. That was among many of their important causes. And they scolded anyone who made inappropriate use of the Confederate battle flag. But by the 1960s, the UDC and allied groups no longer retained enough prestige or influence to prevent the flag being exploited by anyone, however they wanted to do it, including the unfettered merchandising of the Confederate battle flag. So as a result, it became so ubiquitous that some white Southerners, and non-Southerners for that matter, presumed that it was now just a benign consumer artifact of white Southern identity. So we can see bandanas, as Sonya's got a list, for example, at the exhibit, but they're bandanas. These are just ones I found online. Your can holder, I like the bedspread there, that's pretty garish. We have a prom dress down here, we have a wedding dress over there, of course the bikini, and a very welcoming doormat. There's actually a store called the Confederate Store that has hundreds and hundreds of items. It's amazing the things that people have thought to put the Confederate battle flag on. But even while more and more gewgaws and gadgets and doodads have been produced and purchased with the Confederate battle flag, it's still, of course, retained for many Americans, and especially African Americans, close associations with the defense of white supremacy and slavery. So the persisting popularity of the battle flag in the South that has given way from the solid South to the desegregated Sun Belt South, to a South that has been transformed by migrants from elsewhere in the United States, Latin America, and elsewhere, has of course raised questions about what that flag means. Obvious to many of you in a way, but to draw our attention to the relationship between the changes in the South and the symbolism that Sonya is grappling with, and that we're talking about tonight. This is, of course, crude representation of the settling, the massive resettlement of Americans from the Midwest and Northeast to the Sun Belt during the post-war period of time. And one thing that I would point out is it's the migration has continued, of course, up literally to the present day. So this is an ongoing phenomenon that is continually transforming the populations of some parts of the South. This is a very interesting map, I think, because it draws your attention to the recent remigration, if you will, of African Americans in the region. And if you notice in particular, two states, especially in proportion to the population, not so much Florida, but look at Georgia. 129,000 in migrant African Americans is a substantial number. In a state like North Carolina, 53,000 African Americans moving to the state is a very substantial change in the population. And two more. This is an obvious point about the urban clusters. And as you can see, I don't really have a way to point, but if you know where North Carolina is, you can see where Durham and Raleigh is in the sort of center of the state. And that's the beginning of that urban line that runs from over into the triad area of Greensboro, High Point, Winston-Salem, down to Charlotte, Greensburg, Spartanburg, down, of course, to the huge blob of Atlanta, and then over to Birmingham. Well, that is a belt, of course, that's an urban belt, which is at the center of the transformation of the South, as it has been really for the last century and a half. In that area, that's where we're seeing this migration into the South. That's where people are moving to. But it's worth keeping in mind, this is also true at the same time. We have massive ongoing urbanization in the South, in parts of the South, and yet the South remains some of the most rural parts of the country. The largest portion of the population remains rural dwelling in some southern states. So in a state like North Carolina, where you simultaneously, we hear all about the Research Triangle and Charlotte booming, It's also a deeply rural state at the same time. And that's relevant to this topic, as I hope to make clear. How is it relevant? Well, all of these people moving into the South with these very different historical experiences and values are moving into a region that has had no tradition of tolerating diversity, no tradition of pluralism. That's not to say that the region hasn't had a diverse population. It has. But never have the region's institutions been open to all of its people, all of its residents. Now, for the first time in the South's history, white Southerners have to share power in the public sphere with all of their fellow Southerners. So this advent of civic pluralism during the last few decades of the 20th century necessarily has provoked questions about the persistence of the public display of the Confederate battle flag and Confederate symbols in general. Because those symbols, of course, are associated with resistance to pluralism. Well, as I'm sure you know, after the 2015 shooting of 9 African Americans during a prayer service at the Manual African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, even regional tolerance for public displays of the battle flag in civic spaces waned. And so you may recall this image. This was taking down the Confederate battle flag from the South Carolina State House in 2015, which was seen as a remarkable gesture by the Republican state officials of that state. But even as the public officials continued, even as public officials discontinued honoring the flag in public spaces, defenders of Confederate heritage countered by raising used Confederate battle flags on private property near conspicuous spaces and or thoroughfares or interstates. And so this is one example. This is virtually contemporary. That's the flag that flies beside Interstate 66 in northern Alabama, and you cannot miss that when you drive by. As you can see, it is humongous. There are 2 very, very large Confederate battle flags that fly by Interstate 40 in North Carolina. There's one on 95 in Virginia. I think there's one on 66. Anyways, they popped up on private land. Nonetheless, the quarantine of the Confederate flag from public spaces continues apace. Until now, it's virtually complete. I have not seen a Confederate flag flying in public space in the last year, except at Civil War battlefield sites, which is kind of a special situation. Now, of course, some white Southerners still proclaim the battle flag as a symbol of heritage and hate. But white nationalists who give it pride of place beside Nazi and other contentious symbols in public rallies and on social media have cemented its association with contemporary bigotry and violence. And this is